Good afternoon and welcome to Work Where To From Here, the fourth in this six-part webinar series. It's really wonderful to welcome you all. I'm Tara Diamond from AMMA and your facilitator for the series. It's been developed for you by AMMA, Australian Resource and Energy Group, and Compass Group. I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being initiated on the traditional lands of the Turrbal Nation. On behalf of all participants, I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Meanjin people and the traditional owner of the lands in which you joined this gathering from. The format for today's webinar is interactive, so please use the question function on the webinar control panel to ask questions at any time throughout the session, and I'll do my best to get to as many of the questions as possible. Our guest speaker today will be introduced by Luke Howard, who leads the client solutions for ESS, Compass Group's offshore and remote business for the resource and energy industry, including food services, camp facilities management, cleaning, security and allied services. Compass Group Australia has operations in food services and a range of other services covering over 500 sites with a workforce of 11,000 people. And in Luke's area of Compass, ESS covers 106 offshore and remote locations with a workforce of 2,500. Due to his role and extensive experience in strategy, growth and transformation, primarily within the resources industry, Luke is at the forefront of the impacts and changes to work and workforces. So I'll now ask Luke to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you, Luke.
Thanks, Tara, and welcome to everybody online, and thanks for joining us today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest and expert presenter for today's webinar. Professor Alan Duncan is the Director of the Bankwest-Curtain Economic Centre and Bankwest Professor for Economic Policy at Curtin University. Alan has been in these roles since 2012 and previously held key social and economic positions at the University of Canberra and internationally at the University of Nottingham and the University of York. Among his broad range of research fields and interests are the areas of labour and workforce issues, gender equality and economic and social policy evaluation. Alan ranks in the top 5 of economists worldwide, and his research has been published widely in both academic and policy outlets at the highest international reputation. He has served on senior advisory panels and boards for government and public sector organisations around the world, and also given evidence at numerous federal Senate committee inquiries. A truly global, renowned and esteemed economist, Alan's perspective on how the future of work is changing and why we need to rethink work is widely respected and in high demand. Welcome, Alan, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Luke. Thank you very much, Tara, and thank you to you all for joining. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you a little bit about what is a passion of mine and a real commitment of the centre, looking at in the sort of trajectory of the labour market and the future of work. But obviously now more so in context of COVID-19 and the sort of impacts that COVID-19 have been having on labour markets, not just in Australia but worldwide. But to cycle back and explore from a broad perspective the sort of labour market impact of COVID-19, but then also drill down on more specific issues that face the resources sector. So I'm going to try and dip in and out a number of slides to support my talk, and hopefully my technological savvy is sufficiently advanced to be able to do this. So I'd like to start by looking at how the labour market is navigating COVID-19 and particularly whether or not we're seeing any sort of recovery across different sectors of the economy. I'm going to show you some very recent numbers that we've put out as a centre that take advantage of ABS data on labour market outcomes. And clearly the picture isn't very rosy at all. If we look at employment growth in the month and year to July 2020, the latest available figures, you can see that, of course, across the state jurisdictions and in Australia overall, we've seen a very, very heavy impact on employment, down 3.2% in the year to July 2019. Now, you can see that the change, the reduction over the last year in employment is fairly evenly spread between full and part-time work, but there are some signs of a very tacit labour market recovery. If you look at the change in employment over the last month, from June to July of 2020, the last 2 months of available figures, You can see that there's a little bit of positive news, particularly in WA as a strong mining sector, and New South Wales. Victoria, obviously, this is likely to be a fairly fragile recovery, and we are concerned about where Victoria is likely to be travelling over the next month or two. But generally speaking, there's a sense in which there are some jobs recoveries in most states. This picture just shows you the trajectory of job losses and gains over progressive months from March to April in blue, from April to May in red, from May to June in grey, and from June to July in gold. And you can see that whilst for the first 2 months when COVID-19 really hit, of course, there were very strong reductions in employment. But over the last 2 months, you can see there to have been some gains, some recoveries in the counts of jobs in most jurisdictions. The gold diamonds show overall what percentage of jobs that were in place pre-COVID have been recovered. And again, as the point I made earlier, whilst in Victoria the recovery has been sort of stilted by the recent outbreak, in most other jurisdictions, recoveries of 40 to 50% of jobs prior to COVID-19 are common. But wage growths across most jurisdictions remain pretty sluggish. We've used data from the single touch payroll system to gauge the change in wages over the course of March to July and then over the last fortnight. And we can see that, again, pretty much across the piece, but more severely in Western Australia than in other jurisdictions, there have been some quite significant drops in wages. There is a bit of a context of the WA figure, which we'll come to shortly. More recently, again, you can see that wages have levelled out in most circumstances, bar Victoria and ACT. But we feel as though we're potentially just coming to a plateau in the negative impacts that we've faced. But of course, the story in unemployment terms is still, pretty serious, with unemployment rates at historic highs, rising by 2.5 percentage points over the last year. If you compare July 2020 with July 2019, and again, these impacts are pretty severe. There again is some suggestion of a tacit recovery. We can see that in the last month, some jurisdictions have seen a fall in the unemployment rate. But Queensland seems to be doing it a little bit tougher than most, with continued increase over the last month of 1.1 percentage points, taking its unemployment rate to 8.8%, the largest across all state jurisdictions. I'm going to turn now just to the resources sector, more particularly from the perspective of workforce issues and identifying the challenges that the sector is facing. I think it's really important to start with context. If you look at the contributions to the economic growth of the country, mining as a key to resources sector in the standard classifications that we put out in Australia, is absolutely far and ahead. The greatest contributor. This, for example, is the contribution that mining makes to the economy of Western Australia. You can see that in June 2019, mining contributed $84.5 billion to the WA economy. Fully 4 times the size of the next largest sector in construction. You can also see that over the year to the previous full financial year, June 2019, mining continued to contribute growth, unlike some other sectors, in particular construction, where we actually found there to be quite a strong contraction. So the construction sector has been undergoing some challenges, but that predates COVID-19. Now, if you look more particularly at the trajectory of employment in the resources sectors, what I'm showing you here are the top 3 states in terms of resources sector employment. And this shows the trajectory of employment since the start of the millennium, from the year 2000 through to latest data at 2020. So again, the story is very, very strong, particularly in Queensland and Western Australia. The resource sector contributed respectively around 100,000 and 65,000 jobs in those two states, with New South Wales coming in third. Now, the sort of the pattern, if you take a sort of smooth trajectory, you can see that employment in the resources sector across these jurisdictions has been growing. Of course, there was a really strong surge in around 2012, 2013. That declined slightly, but before picking up again in around the middle of 2018. In trend or smooth terms, the trajectory of employment has grown in Western Australia and plateaued in Queensland. But if you look at the unsmooth or latest original jobs figures, particularly in Western Australia, you can see there will be some dip, which we're hoping is a very short-lived dip. And we have evidence to suggest that is indeed the case, that the fall in the number of employees in the resource sector in Western Australia, for example, is a very temporary phenomenon. These are data that show the wages and jobs indices that are drawn from the single touch payroll system, which are effectively the most up-to-date and the most contemporary set of data that we have on patterns of employment and wages growth. The orange schedule shows you the total wages index drawn from the single touch payroll system, and the blue schedule shows you a payroll jobs index from the resource sector. And in both cases, you can see that in broad terms, over the period from January of this year to end of July, we end up pretty much where we started the year in terms of this index. There is this odd bump with the wages index at around February and March, but that's because of a peculiarity of the resources sector in a period during which bonuses tend to be determined and given. And so really that's just a temporary structural phenomenon for the resource sector in particular. So I think the general message that we're drawing from these data is that actually, in employment terms, the resource sector have navigated through the course of the pandemic in reasonably good health, and indeed you can start to see in both jobs and wages the trend being very gradually positive. The story is similar across the three key states of New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia. The extent of the increase in wage indices at around bonus time in March is most pronounced in Western Australia and least pronounced in New South Wales. But again, if you compare where this index starts the year and where it has ended up, in most jurisdictions, the comparative levels of wages and jobs are pretty much similar, with a very gradual rising trajectory. And of course, in looking at those figures, it then begs the question about whether or not the resources sector is benefiting from some of the government supports that are available. The key supports to businesses as going concerns from the perspective of the labour market is, of course, the JobKeeper payment counts. This figure shows you the extent to which JobKeeper payments are distributed across industry sector in raw counts, as shown by the gold bars, and expressed as a percentage of the industry workforce, shown with the hash bars. Now, clearly, most of the JobKeeper payments have been going in towards professional, scientific and technical services, health and construction and accommodation and food, of course, as well as retail. At the other end of the spectrum, in the mining sector, as well as electricity, gas, water and waste services, you can see that there are both in absolute terms and as a share of the workforce, there's very little resource being drawn from JobKeeper payments. And of course, there's a reason for that. This chart shows or compares the proportion of the industry workforce that's in receipt of JobKeeper on the horizontal of this schedule against the proportion of firms reporting decreased revenues of more than 25%. And of course, that's one of the key criteria for eligibility for JobKeeper, that your turnover needs to have been hit by at least 30% relative to the same time last year. And if you look at mining, in both terms, there are very few businesses reporting decreased revenues at that level. And so that's the principal reason why JobKeeper is not a key component of the support through COVID-19 for this sector. Again, conscious of time, so what I'd like to do is perhaps move more towards a look at some of the particular trends that have emerged over the course of COVID-19 around workforce and working arrangements, because I think this represents a really quite interesting phenomenon and an interesting forced experiment that COVID-19 has placed upon us. There has been very much a move towards greater flexibility in employment and a move towards a greater share of people being forced to work from home. That then begs a number of questions about whether or not this, as an arrangement, has hit businesses in any degree, whether or not it's actually revealed opportunities for a more flexible arrangement between workers and their employers. So what I'm going to do is take you through a few of the findings from a recent briefing that BCC put out to look at the prevalence of working from home. These data predate the COVID-19 pandemic, but I think they're a useful point of reference to see where industries may be going in the future in this context. So, show my screen. There we go. So if we look at data that are collected from the population of Australian households and workers, we're able to capture from their responses to a series of questionnaires the prevalence of working from home arrangements, either informal or formal. So these data I'm showing you on the screen now just show the proportion of workers who regularly work from home, split by industry, but also split by occupation. So around half of workers in the agriculture, forestry and fishing sector regularly work from home. Education and training as a sector, again, is a sector that supports very strong working from home arrangements. Across other sectors, you can see that there's a decline, and for example, in retail, clearly not an occupation that that allows much working from home. Around 11% of workers have that as a regular arrangement. For mining, 15.4% of workers regularly work from home. In terms of the occupational gradient, you can see that the absolute prevalence of working from home arrangements is in the managerial and the professional workforce, with progressively less of this type of arrangement for the other occupational strata. And I think it then starts to beg some questions on the benefits and dangers, both for companies and for workers, of flexible or arrangements whereby people may be working from home. So for companies, for example, as I mentioned, COVID-19 does represent a forced experiment on working from home, and there's some evidence of positive perceptions amongst businesses who may, prior to COVID-19, have felt a reluctance to allow for these sorts of arrangements, but who have found during the course of COVID-19 that what the workforce has actually been delivering quite strongly. Now, of course, not all occupational roles benefit from working from home arrangements. And I think the breakdown by occupation, by industry class, shows that certain occupational roles require presence. There are benefits to companies from direct costs savings, and also some evidence of improved productivity. It's not a strong bank of evidence, but more should follow this period of time where people have been spending more time working from home. Now, for workers, there have been studies that have pointed to a positive productivity gain for many workers, and the opportunity to balance work and family demands But against that, there is the capacity for flexible work arrangements to potentially exacerbate domestic conflict, and also it lends to an intrusion of work into non-work time, with often longer hours being spent by people who have this arrangement in place. The positive benefits seem to be stronger with formal agreements and with a blended arrangement of working from home and in the office. So I want to finish now just by going through a few key observations on the outlook for the resources sector. Certainly the case that resources remains a major contributor to economic growth, and is a key sector for Australia, is a key sector for WA, a key sector for Queensland. In the resources sector, employment does appear to be holding up well, but it's still fairly heavily dominated by the full-time workforce. There were some concerns that in resources there would be the negative impact from weak export demand, but this doesn't seem to have eventuated. Export demand seems to have been holding up. What I think is really critical is for there to be a sustained investment in resources projects in order to drive growth. One of the strongest drivers of growth over the course of an economic decline is investment. And so it's absolutely imperative that this continues for the resources sector. And in that regard, it's really critical that the government needs to follow through with its commitment to bring forward investment projects and to facilitate business decisions. I think the final that with hard border closures and with the likelihood of those border closures being with us for some time, I think this does contribute to a risk of skills shortage, and particularly the stagnating flow of international labour potentially compromising the continued growth that we'd like to see through and out of the other side of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there were my key take-homes on the outlook for the resource sector, and I'm very happy now to stop and open up for any questions that might have been lodged.
That's wonderful. I'm going to get started with a question I got very early on. It must have related to some of your very early slides because of the categorisation of the ABS in relation to oil and gas, because mining obviously captures some, and energy, utilities, etc., captures some of the energy as well. But we have seen, very much a double whammy for the oil and gas sector. So the question asks, are we seeing any impact on the data from the professor in relation to the impact on oil and gas from a commodity price perspective, and has that had an impact on their labour, on the labour market?
Look, yeah, it's a very good question. The data that we have from single touch payroll, which is the most recent data available, it doesn't have that level of granularity, so one can only really apply or apportion some of the broader trends and look to apportion that to oil and gas. But I think in other data that we've been able to access, I think it is true to say that amongst the oil and gas businesses for which we have information, the labour market impacts have been substantially more severe. And in relation to the uptake of JobKeeper, we've also seen there to be proportionately a far greater drawdown of JobKeeper from sort of industry groups or granularities below the top sector. So I think it is fair to say that that relatively oil and gas is perhaps doing it tougher than most within the range of subsectors.
Thank you. And for this one, I'm going to summarise, because there's quite a lot of questions around the area where you touched on around flexible work or forced working from home and productivity, because you did touch on a few times from an employer's and from an employee's perspective that there is some productivity. Can you bring some of that to life for us? Because there'll be a number of people on as the participants that will be really worried about that productivity in their workforce, saying, well, how do I know that I'm getting that productivity, and that this isn't going to really hit a bit of a ceiling in terms of people's ability to sustain this productivity while working from home? There's lots of questions around there between the link between two. So any insights would be great.
Yeah, look, as I say, the evidence on the productivity gains from a hard economic perspective is pretty scant. But of the few evaluations that have taken place, there was one experiment that was conducted, not within Australia but in another jurisdiction, which randomly assigned people to work from home against working from the office, and those that were working from home in a very particular sector, granted this was in actually call centre, their productivity gains from working from home were measurable. Now, a lot of those gains, so the business gained overall, it gained in terms of productivity, but the majority of the gains were more to do with costs and more to do with the fact that working from home arrangements mitigated some of the costs that would otherwise occur. When it comes to the workforce, when one looks at evidence on the benefits or otherwise of working from home amongst employees, there have been, so it's not absolutely clear cut and cut and dried. It is the case that flexibility was valued, and flexibility did allow for a capacity to balance work and non-work commitments. Allowed for a very easy transition and a more low-cost transition from non-work commitments to work commitments. So in that regard, that lent itself to some capacity to do more within a defined period of time. If you look at the levels of job satisfaction, we found there to be very little difference in job satisfaction between women who do and don't work from home. But interestingly, for women who work from home, there was a generally lower level of satisfaction with their hours. And this tends to be driven by the fact of the inability to separate or draw a line between work and non-work tasks whilst at home. And this is why, in terms of the benefits, the most positive benefits occurred when there was a formal arrangement with a defined set of hours and an absolute understanding that the workday ends at a certain point, even if you are working from home, and that non-work tasks can start. So it is very much a double-edged sword, I think, from the employee's perspective. From the employer's perspective, limited and scant evidence, but I think the flexibility does seem to be valued by a good share of the employees who are able to enter into that arrangement.
Because as you say, it's really been a forced experiment, but many would say that it wasn't flexible work because everybody just got sent home. There wasn't that agreement between employer and employee about what their working week or their working roster, how that changed, and things like that. So it's really.
What's actually quite interesting is if you look at the prevalence of working from home over time, you get the sense there's been a rising trend, but actually that's not the case. It's been pretty flat, possibly over the last 10 to 15 years, around 10 or 11% of people would regularly work from home as an arrangement, and a subset of those would then have a formal working from home arrangement with their employer. So it's not as if the future of work is flexible, at least not at this stage. There's little evidence at this stage to suggest that this is going to be a new normal. But I do think the blended arrangement of working periods of time in the office and periods of time at home, I do think that will become more prevalent as the COVID-19 experience matures in the sort of business plans of organisations.
Thank you. You touched on, there's a couple of questions here, just two, about the gendered impact of COVID. We're hearing a lot from the media. In fact, I'm seeing a lot through our work with the Australian Resource and Women's Alliance, some people looking to try and get an evidence base around the gendered impact of COVID. That's very difficult in the resources industry because we have such a male-dominated industry, but there are people asking for any further insights around the gendered impact, whether it's broadly all industries or whether you've got any insights for resources more specifically?
Well, I think you're quite right to point out that in resources, the circumstances are very particular. And so it's a lot harder to draw out any sort of strong evidence based on the resources sector. The observation that you make of it being a very gendered workforce is certainly one. The other observation is that in the full-time part-time split in the resources sector is very, very heavily full-time. In relation to the gendered impact of COVID-19, I think that stands in contrast to some other sectors where we have a more casualized workforce where there's a far greater prevalence of part-time versus full-time work, and where the workforce is sort of gendered, sort of female-dominated sectors such as accommodation, retail, education, and the like. It is the case that that in terms of the impact in relation to job losses, in relation to the take-up of JobKeeper and those are transiting onto JobSeeker, I think there is evidence that women are facing far greater impost than men. We did some work that looked at the rate of loss of casual jobs and found that to be very heavily dominated by women. I think at a rate of around 2 to 1. The other observation I think that has been ignored in all of the conversation around the requirements for accessing JobKeeper is of those who are in multiple forms of employment, people who have more than one job. There are around 1 million men and 1 million women in Australia who hold down more than one job. JobKeeper can only be held for one position. And so at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, when JobKeeper came into play, there was essentially a requirement for people to choose which of the jobs that they were holding down they would seek to put forward themselves JobKeeper, should they be eligible from a contractual perspective. And so that tends to push people away from maintaining multiple roles. Of course, now we have a situation where JobKeeper has shifted from one flat payment of $750 a week to 2 payments of either $600 or $375, depending on if you're full-time or part-time work. But of course, if somebody was holding down 2 part-time jobs, one of those jobs has been let go because accessing JobKeeper required them effectively to choose roles. And if now their role as a part-time worker in one role is going to attract $375 rather than $750 a week, then that could have really quite fundamental implications on the support that people who previously had multiple jobs are able to draw from government. And so I think that dynamic has probably been lost. It is the case that the multiple job holders amongst women tend to be more between education, health and retail sectors, whereas the multiple job holders amongst men are more in construction, a very small amount of mining, but in public administration and safety. So I think that, to your questioner, there is some evidence that the impact is going to be more heavily felt by women than men in most sectors, but the resource sector, I think, is a very particular circumstance, which is hard to extrapolate from.
And, shutdowns and maintenance is an example where employees in resources and energy work for multiple employers throughout their whole year. So that adds another level of complexity in terms of which employer they're aligned to as a contractor, as an independent contractor using their skills.
Yeah, so just on that point, a really important point you made about complexity. JobKeeper was proposed as the first arrangement of JobKeeper was proposed as being very simple. It needed to be acted on quickly. But it's one of those policies where underlying, on the face of it, a simple arrangement, underlying that are a whole range of complex issues. So there's a lot of hidden complexity in some of the arrangements, and this is what we're now finding with some of the recasting of JobKeeper to JobKeeper 2 to try and circumvent some of the complexities that were previously in place. Sorry to cut you off.
No, in fact, there's a question on that, and the question relates to, we've had the suite of job keeper, seeker, etc. Is there anything globally that we've learnt from other countries around how they've managed this impact on workforces that we as Australia should be looking to?
So we've actually just prepared a paper for publication that compares the original JobKeeper and JobKeeper 2 with some alternative structures that we think better overcome some of the inherent weaknesses. And in that we did compare Australia with international comparator countries and their arrangements. The first JobKeeper was essentially a policy that was designed with multiple objectives in mind. So JobKeeper sort of version 1 was designed simultaneously to support workers, to support their employers, and also to provide stimulus. And so it's simple in some respects, but it was designed to get money pumped into the economy really quickly. And in that regard, you can't fault the government. But it very quickly became apparent that there were some issues and complexities. People were actually receiving more in JobKeeper than they were previously paid as in employment. The lack of capacity to match jobs, the fact that you had to have a census date for assessment for eligibility for JobKeeper. In terms of the extent of your turnover loss at one point in time, they have a census date for the employees, the workers, that could for which you could claim JobKeeper again at one point in time. These are all issues that have been, some of which have been dealt with under JobKeeper 2, but in other jurisdictions have been dealt with more flexibly. So we stand apart from pretty much every other international jurisdiction where there is a wage subsidy, an emergency wage subsidy, but it typically is proportionate to pay, either 80% or 70% of actual pay prior to COVID-19 rather than a flat rate. New Zealand is the only exception, and actually New Zealand started with a 2-tier system, which is essentially JobKeeper 2. The other really important arrangements that have been put in place in other jurisdictions is of a sliding scale of eligibility depending upon the extent of the loss of turnover from the COVID-19 pandemic and the rate of recovery. One of the real dangers is you introduce a policy which can distort recovery. And one of the real issues with the JobKeeper arrangement is of the single turnover threshold of 30%. That therefore means if you're a business that's recovering and you're starting to approach the 30% threshold, there's every incentive for you to attenuate your continued recovery, because you know that if you pass the threshold from 30 to 25% turnover loss relative to pre-COVID, you would no longer qualify for JobKeeper. And so there's a potential for an unintended distorting impact of JobKeeper for that reason, whereas in other jurisdictions, you've got a sliding scale of eligibility depending on the degree to which your turnover falls short of pre-COVID levels. So, and in the paper that we released, we introduced what we regard to be a better model, which combines a sliding turnover scale and a proportionate subsidy.
Interesting, and I know JobKeeper is, the resources industry has only been taken up as very, very low. But I know also on the call, we have a lot of different companies through the supply chain who might be categorized as something else. So I thought they might be, that's why I wanted to raise those questions with you. Just the last couple of questions that we have time for. You touched on, and again, I'm grouping a range of questions, so hopefully participants can hear their questions through this. You touched on the things that are required in terms of sustained investment and, in terms of the hard border closures. This is something that's a very big concern to the resources and energy industry, moving people around Australia, not just in relation to FIFO, but when they're putting people into particular jobs at a particular location outside their state of residence. And we also saw in the media this week the Prime Minister making some statements that he's wanting National Cabinet to really look at some consistency around the border closures and what should happen. From a workforce and productivity perspective, it'd be ideal that we could start opening up the borders, but we're dealing with a pandemic. What would you say employers should be really asking their governments, local members, in terms of, the impact on businesses and you touched on Queensland earlier, having a bigger impact in terms of their employment, but also their wages. That might have something to do with their tourism industry. But what would you say in relation to the border closures? People are asking for a bit more detail about that because it's such a big topic for our industry.
It's a huge topic, and it's a really challenging topic when you have when you have the interface of clear epidemiological concerns and health imperatives around border closures versus the economic impact. I suppose all I would point out is that clearly the matching of skills to roles and the capacity to optimize your workforce in terms of the roles that are being performed and where those roles are being performed is really key. The efficiency with which you can target your workforce at business activity is clearly going to lend itself to continued growth. We're absolutely very, very far from an optimal position at the moment. The capacity for one to be able to adapt skills to suit different roles, I think, can go some of the way. And I know this is perhaps one of the reasons for the government's announcement of the job trainer package, to see if we can really generate adaptable skills and transferable skills in order to make a more sort of fluid allocation of labour in a world where there are challenges from border closures. That'll take you some of the way, but of course it's not going to bring you people with very particular and niche technical skills, and possibly that is more of an issue and a challenge in the resources sector than it is in some other industry sectors. So it's most certainly not ideal. I find it very difficult as an economist to say, okay, on that basis we should open up the borders, because we know that the imperative is to gain control from a health and well-being perspective. But I suppose the point I would make is simply that the consequence of the lack of access to particularly highly skilled and highly technically advanced or niche roles, that is not going to help. If there are some pragmatic solutions that would allow for a channel of flow of skilled labour across borders with clear protections from a health perspective, then I think that would be desirable. But of course, logistically, that's quite a hard one to pull off.
But I wanted to just haul out a question that is in there in the panel, but also we've been hearing a lot lately, which is, will this pandemic mean that people will start to live where they work in the resources and energy industry? That's really a hot topic of conversation. And as an economist, you won't have the answer to that, so I won't put you in the seat for it. But I wanted to recognise that is the big question that everyone's asking. Will it encourage and will it force people to look very differently at, as an individual, where they live, but as an employer, their employment models and strategies?
Yeah, look, and I think it might do. It certainly might do. One of the things that we've realised from the pandemic is that certain things that we felt were necessary, through face-to-face arrangements, being perfectly serviceable, remotely. And so my incapacity to operate my mic aside, these sorts of conversations work tremendously well. But I mean, I certainly think in the resource sector there is maybe a bit of there might be a channel of people locating closer to work, and of course that's one of the reasons why Premier McGowan introduced a package of incentives to seek to attract FIFO workers perhaps to relocate to Western Australia rather than continue with current arrangements. So maybe it is a bit of a shape of things to come, we'll see.
Well, we have gone over time because I did want to get to as many questions, and I have, I beg forgiveness that I have grouped a lot of the questions on there for this fascinating session. I want to thank you sincerely, Professor Alan Duncan, for your sharing your insights and experience and analytics and the work that your team's been doing. We've at AMMA been closely watching all of the reports that you've been putting out. The analysis that you've been doing has been really important and interesting for our industry from a workforce perspective. So thank you so much. Thank you, Luke, at the beginning from Compass Group, getting us started. And I want to let everybody know that thank you so much, Luke, that we post the recordings for these webinars on the AMMA website. We already have the previous 3 sessions posted there, so that if someone in your team or your colleagues have missed the session today, you're able to direct them to hear directly from Professor Duncan, his observations. I want to close the webinar now because we're slightly over time, but thank you again, Professor Duncan. Thank you, Luke. And we'll return next week at the same time for the next episode of Work Where To From Here. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day. Yeah.